Hi, everyone. Welcome into this virtual space. This is the Montana Book Festival's last event of the evening. I'm just going to wait a couple more seconds while people come in. But my introduction is fairly long, so I might as well just get going on that. As I said, welcome to this Montana Book Festival event. This particular event features Iris Jamahl Dunkle and Lisa Hendrickson. This is Women's Studies, Trailblazing Women of the American West. We're all very excited for this event. This event is sponsored by a number of different organizations and businesses, including Arts Missoula, MissoulaEvents.net, the Whitefish Review, Humanities Montana, and the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation. Thank you so much to our sponsors for sponsoring the festival and this individual event. My name is Lauren Korn. I'm the director of the Montana Book Festival. I'm zooming in from my office in the Mountain West Publishing Company building here in Missoula, Montana. The Montana Book Festival acknowledges that we are in the Aboriginal territories of the Salish and Kalispel people. The name Missoula comes from the Bitterroot Salish word in Missoudletko, which means place of freezing water. This name has been used for over 12,000 years since the existence of Glacial Lake Missoula. The first Europeans who came here borrowed the Salish term in Missoudletko and modified the word to Missoula. Later, when Glacial Lake Missoula melted, the Bitterroot Salish began using an additional term for Missoula, which means place of the small bull trout. In 1855, the Bitterroot Salish were forced to sign the Hellgate Treaty, and following this treaty, the United States government carried out forced assimilation, removal, and genocide against the Salish and other peoples in their efforts to acquire land. Despite centuries of colonial theft and oppression, the Tutyakan people are still here and thriving on their Aboriginal lands. The Montana Book Festival strives, and we will continue to strive to help promote Indigenous voices as one of the ways our organization acknowledges and respects the Aboriginal peoples of Missoula. For those of you zooming in from outside Missoula, I encourage you to let us know where you're zooming in from. Let us know where you are. Throw your locations into the chat. We'd love to see kind of where everyone's coming from tonight. A few logistics before we begin. I'd like to invite you as attendees to submit your questions via the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. There are two different sort of engagement functions here in Zoom webinar space. Q&A, that's for questions. If you have questions for Iris or Lisa, throw them there. And then there's the chat, and we'll be working on the back end, kind of throwing links out to books where you can purchase books, stuff like that. And you can certainly talk amongst yourselves in the chat too. But if you have questions specifically that you want Lisa and Iris to answer, put them in the Q&A. On the back end of things, Sarah Capdeville and we will be monitoring and keeping things going. I also want to note, and this is part of the link thing, I also want to note that if you're interested in purchasing Iris's and Lisa's books, you can do so through our festival bookseller, Fact and Fiction Books, who's here in Missoula, Montana. Their website is factandfictionbooks.com. Please be sure to enter MBF as a checkout code at checkout so that 20% of the sales from festival titles comes back, sales come back to the festival. So now I'd love to introduce our authors this evening. Iris Jamahl Dunkle is an award-winning literary biographer, essayist, and poet. Her academic and creative work challenges the Western myth of progress by examining the devastating impact that agriculture and overpopulation have had and continue to have on the North American West. Taking an eco-feminist bent, her writing also challenges the American West male-oriented recorded history by researching the lives of women. She obtained her MFA in poetry from New York University and her PhD in American literature from Case Western Reserve University. Dunkle lives in the San Francisco Bay Area. Welcome, Iris.
Thank you.
And Lisa Hendrickson is the owner of Lisa Hendrickson Communications and a former corporate and nonprofit public relations director. She has written or edited 5 books, including Indiana at 200, a celebration of the Hoosier State, and I don't know how to pronounce this, Caritzis. Thank you. I'm sorry. Caritzis and Me, Enduring 63 Hours at Gunpoint. So welcome, Iris and Lisa. I'm so excited for this conversation. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Lisa. Nice to be with you here.
You too. We're so happy to be here. And I'll just say that Iris and I have gotten to know each other and our books and found so many similarities between our books and the women we wrote about. So we're excited to be here to talk about them today.
Definitely. It was a joy to read your book, Lisa, and to explore other women that broke the boundaries of gender and stereotypes that we put there for them living in that time period.
Absolutely. And I learned so much from your book as well. I loved reading it. I felt like I knew Charmian when I was done. And we had talked about both of us doing a little bit of reading and having a conversation about our books. So, Iris, you want to start?
Sure, I'd love to.
I don't care.
No, I'd love to. So I wrote the first biography of Charmian Kittredge London, who was, amongst other things, Jack London's wife. And in my 6 years studying her, I discovered that she had helped write many of Jack's books and had really led him on the adventures that they went to. And during those 6 years, I not only wrote a biography, but as a way to process the archives, I wrote a book of poems, which were in a response to the archival materials that I found, which were really upsetting because she had really been erased from her husband's life. So I thought I would read the opening section because I rarely read it at a reading. It's called How to Tell the Story of a Life. And I start my book in the middle of the story because that's the point where Charmian started to be erased. Charmian's short chestnut hair was damp and her skin was cool from her hour-long swim in the lake on London Ranch, where she and her husband, the famed American author Jack London, used to swim together. It was a perfect summer day in 1934, almost 20 years after his death. The August sun swung high in the sky. Hawks circled the thermals in meandering loops, letting out piercing cries. Taking it all in, she rode her horse Patty down the rolling golden hills on Northern California's Sonoma Mountain. Even at 65 years old, she kept her body fit with a daily swim and horseback ride. Halfway down the hill, the glint of sun against a string of barbed wire startled Patty, and the horse shied, tripped, and fell to its knees. Losing her grip, Charmian was thrown, her foot locked in the stirrup. As her beloved horse struggled to stand, its immense weight rolled over and crushed Charmian's tiny frame. She screamed for what she thought would be the last time. Down the hill, Eliza Shepherd, Jack's stepsister and Charmian's close friend, whom she called Sis, and who managed the ranch, heard Charmian scream and rushed to the scene, fearing Charmian would be dead when she found her. Eliza ordered her son, Irving, and her daughter-in-law, Mildred, to call an ambulance. She ran to Charmian's crumpled form and found her mangled and moaning, but still conscious. Together, the three carried her down the hill. The ambulance arrived and rushed Charmian to a nearby hospital where for the next 7 days she remained in critical condition. Bay Area headlines warned of her imminent death. The horse had crushed 2 of her ribs and punctured her lung. Her entire body bloomed in deep purple bruises, but Charmian proved physically and mentally tough enough to pull through. Once released, she spent the following weeks recuperating on her narrow bed in the screened-in sleeping porch of the cottage, the same place where she had lost Jack to renal failure at age 40. She was fiercely independent and remarkably self-sufficient, and bed rest made her uneasy. On a normal day, she would exercise the horses and check on the other livestock, and then spend the rest of her day writing. Now she was too sore to sit at a desk. To be sure, Eliza brought over lunch and sat with her as she ate it. While visiting, Eliza updated Charmian on the ranch's strained finances and its daily operations, reporting on who was exercising the horses and how the ranch could earn new revenue. Despite their struggles with the ranch, They helped neighbors by inviting them to hunt for food in their forested mountainside. But when Eliza was away or when Mildred's young children were not popping in, Charmian was alone. Sitting in her bed in the stifling August heat, she realized how desperately she wanted to be remembered. She wanted her books to remain in print. She wanted the ranch to remain a monument to the life she and Jack had lived. She wanted all that she had dedicated her life to, the life she had forged and the one that she had recorded and shared with Jack, to be properly remembered and celebrated. She decided that as soon as she recovered and was able, she would do three things. First, she would finish and move into the grand home and museum she had been building for 15 years. Second, she would persist and pull herself out of her writing slump and begin writing and publishing again. Third, she would find someone whom reviewers would perceive as both professional and unbiased to write Jack's biography. Months later, as she was looking up at the milky stars on her balcony, she thought she saw a light halfway up Sonoma Mountain. The light flickered and then became a solid glow like a low star. What was it? She owned the land on that part of the mountain, and as far as she knew, no one lived up there. She stared at this light for an hour, watching it blink like a beacon. Then it began to move down the face of the mountain like a glowing orb. The orb came toward her, stopping only 100 yards away. A shadowy figure seemed to emerge from the light. She was convinced the figure was Jack's spirit. Such spiritual visions were not unusual throughout her life. Just after his death, another vision of him had appeared on the same mountain, up the slope of green grass. This time, the shadowy figure did not come near enough for her to see its face, but she knew it was Jack. He wanted his life properly regarded and remembered. It was time to find someone to tell the story of his life. Within a few weeks, her vision proved true. On a mild July day, a 33-year-old writer named Irving Stone stopped by the famed London ranch to see where his favorite author had lived and meet Charmian. Eliza directed him to the House of Happy Walls, where Charmian now lived. When he knocked on her door, Charmian greeted him and gave him a brief tour of the downstairs, showing him the Jack London room, where she had just finished setting up Jack's desk as it had been in the cottage. Stone was ecstatic. He sat behind the desk and pretended to write. Charmian thought he was a bit too enthusiastic. She brought out a tray with tea, and they sat in the sunny blue and green tiled dining room, looking out at the dramatic view of Sonoma Valley. Stone wasn't only interested in Jack. He also asked, was she still writing? She told him about her new writing project, The Log of the Dirigo, a book much like her successful book, The Log of the Snark, about their journey on a schooner from Baltimore around Cape Horn to Seattle. Although his enthusiasm grated on her nerves, it felt good to talk to another writer again. She was isolated at the ranch. When she was younger, she spent weeks at a time in San Francisco or Oakland, catching up with friends over lunches and going to plays or films in the evening. Now the Glen Ellen Railroad no longer operated. She rarely left the ranch. She had purchased a new car, but she hadn't learned to drive it yet and had to rely on Eliza's son to give her rides. Stone provided very welcome company. His visit was a reminder that she was still respected as a writer, and it felt energizing to discuss a possible writing project. Talking to Stone brought back a bit of the intellectual verve she experienced talking with Jack about books, what they were reading and what they were dreaming up to write. Then Stone revealed the real reason for his visit. He wanted to write a biography about Jack. He admired London as both a writer and a socialist. And what pursued afterwards was that he convinced Charmian to sign away all of her rights to write, so he could write a biography not just about Jack, but also about Charmian. And within it, after he seduced Charmian into making that decision, he wrote Charmian a version of Charmian that was like a airhead that really hindered her husband's life more than helped it. And so I started the biography in this spot as a way to kind of correct the story, to to show where her story was erased and then bring it back again.
I love how you started the book. And you created such a beautiful picture, and I can tell that you're a poet because of your descriptions are lovely. And I won't say too much about Irving Stone because people will have to read the book, but I can see why you started the book where you did. And what prompted you to decide that you wanted to spend so much time researching and writing about her life?
Well, I had gone to the park as a child when I was in sixth grade. I went on a field trip to Jack London State Park, and I got to know Jack London and fell in love with his work. But I didn't know on that day I was also meeting another writer, because Charmian was not shown. Her story wasn't truly shown at the park. And so when I finally discovered her as a writer and saw her life story, started to unearth it and realized that she actually had, done all of these things, I couldn't help but tell her story. It was very, very necessary. And it
Go ahead.
kept me busy for 6 years.
For 6 years. Okay. That was going to be my next question. And as you were researching her life, did you encounter any obstacles because in your book, you talk about how she had destroyed her early diaries. And did that create an issue for you, or how did you go about finding that information?
Yeah, that's so at the end of that first chapter, when Stone ends up publishing this horrible version of his biography, his fictional biography is called is about Jack London, but it also really makes her out to be, like, basically says that he committed suicide because of her. I mean, it's very extreme. And because of that, she burned many of her documents, and then she locked all the other documents in the Huntington Library, and no one could access them for many, many years. And so that's unknowingly, she had just kind of like cut off any scholarship about her, so that the only version of her that would stay would be Irving Stone's. And so for me, it took a while to get to the actual information. I found I had to do a lot of primary research to find her story, because it was really incorrect. Even her death certificate was incorrect. Like, so much information about her was incorrect.
That's interesting. And one of the things that struck me about your book was it seems to me that Charmian and Jack, they had such a symbiotic relationship that she wrote, many people might not know that she wrote many of the descriptions that he used in his books, and she edited his works, and she transcribed his work. And so it seems that they made each other better, both as writers and maybe in other ways as well. Do you agree with that, or do you see it that way?
It's a complicated thing to answer, because he was an intense guy. Like, Jack London was charismatic. He was, I think he was the kind of guy that walked into a room and everybody paid attention to him. And he was really demanding as a husband, because she was not only in charge, she was in charge of all his, like, typing up all of his stories and editing them, and then also doing all his correspondence. And I mean, had to navigate and schedule all their social events. I mean, it was exhausting. And then he always wanted to be, like, engaged and, talking, and it was really curious about, they had this amazing intellectual connection. So they fueled each other for sure. And they were very attracted to each other. I mean, she recorded in her diary every time they had sex. So it was a very healthy relationship in that sense. But I think it was something that, it was an intensity that both inspired her, but also held her back in many ways.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. In terms of writing, you talk about after his death, and she wrote the books that she wrote, that her writing, you described her writing as, I think it was difficult and a little over the top in terms of description. And so, um, yet Jack used her descriptions in his book. So could you talk a little bit more about how you think they influenced each other's writing style?
Definitely. So the book that she did the most work on is called The Valley of the Moon, and it's a quest motif. It has a this couple, Billy and Saxon, that go on a quest basically from the Bay Area all around the West Coast to try to find the perfect home to start a farm. You know, a 160-acre farm is what they're setting out to do in the Western tradition. But the quest is different. At its center is a woman, and she's the one that has a vision, and we get to know Saxon very intimately. She loses a baby. We're inside her head, and she is actually like a real woman. And at this time in literature, 1912, this is very rare to see. And so scholars have always said, like, oh wow, how did Jack must have really known women? Like, it was such an amazing feat. But the reality is that Charmian had actually she wrote those scenes and helped him see what it was like to lose. She had lost her baby, and she had used her own personal experience, her mother's story, as part of the book as well. And so that's a place where it really helped. And like her book, The Log of the Snark, is one that that Jack actually helped edit a great deal, because it was published during his lifetime. And you could see that, that was a great relationship, because Charmian would overdo it and just overwrite things, and she needed someone to help trim it back a bit sometimes. And once Jack died and she wasn't talking to her Aunt Netta anymore, who also did editing, she didn't have that kind of, structure to help her revise her work. And so you do see, like, her biography about Jack London is 2 volumes long, and it is very long and includes a lot of information, which is good for scholars, but it also is heartwarming in parts of it, but it's very long.
She needed a good editor.
She did.
Another thing, I was surprised to learn that Charmian was really quite famous in her time. I mean, they were a celebrity couple. I thought you could have seen them today on, any sort of gossip show. It sounded like there were reporters always waiting for them, every port they sailed into. And he continues to be quite famous, but she is not well known at all. And why do you think that is?
Well, I think it has a lot to do with Irving Stone, to begin with. I think it also has I think it has to do with the fact that she didn't have children that survived. So no one really carried on her legacy. She did, and she had dementia at the end of her life. And so many of her memories, the people who knew her, who had already passed away, like Eliza, who was her best friend, and it was Jack's stepsister. So the generation that knew her a lot, as they didn't know who she was before. And I think that's why a lot of the information, went away. And she put so much energy into, securing Jack's legacy. She went all around the world and got him in translation. He's translated into 52 countries, and that has everything to do with her. And I think she was also translated, but not as many. And her efforts were more in his work rather than her own, even though she did put, place like on, she saw herself as a writer first.
Mm-hmm. And after his death, it was interesting to see how she evolved, or even towards the end of his life, she was starting to assert herself more, and she wanted to make sure that she had time to write herself, and really seemed to almost blossom in a way after his death.
Yeah, I mean, she was kind of 2 minds. That's what I call that chapter, because she was mourning losing him, losing her, her mate, as she called him. But she also had this freedom that had just opened up to her. It's like that scene in Kate Chopin's The Story of an Hour, where the woman, I don't know if you know the short story, but the woman's husband dies, she thinks, in a train accident. And so she has a heart condition, and so everyone's trying to protect her, and she goes into her room, and she's sad, and then all of a sudden she realizes, oh my gosh, I'm free. I'm free to do anything I want with my life. And I think for Charmian, it was a very similar experience. You know, she felt freed to in a way that she hadn't been the way she had been before she met Jack. She was fiercely independent. She's college educated. She traveled the world. You know, she had a career before she met Jack. And I think, you know, that came back to her in the end.
She really was a modern woman, much like Julia Bennett in my book. And it was interesting to me how they both kind of defied convention, ignored convention, just did what they wanted to do.
Totally. Speaking of Julia Bennett, would you like to maybe read a section of your book to us?
Certainly, I would. Um, so I'll just give a brief introduction. Burning the Breeze, wrong side here, Burning the Breeze, Three Generations of Women in the American West, is about the story of Julia Bennett, who was the first woman to own and operate independently a dude ranch in Montana. I started to write the book about Julia because I was fascinated with her life. And as I researched it, I realized it was really not just the story of Julia, but of her mother and grandmother who fled the Civil War in Missouri when her grandmother was a young widow and her mother was 7 years old. They left in a wagon train to go to the Montana Territory, and they established lives there. And all three of them were very independent women who built lives for themselves. So I'll start with the first chapter of my book, which starts with Julia in New York City, and I start each chapter with a quote from another book. So, chapter 1. In Western dramas, authenticity must consist of cowboys with their chaps, pronounced chaps, their wide brim or 10-gallon, as we say here, hats, a kerchief about the neck, and high-heeled fancy boots. Though the outfit be utilitarian, it is also held to be romantic by those who have the West close to their romantic hearts. The New York Times, March 1st, 1931. On a chilly February morning in 1931, Mrs. Julia Bennett, who just a few days earlier had arrived on a train from her native Montana, stood by the front door of New York City's Northern Pacific Railway office. She didn't know a soul, and she had only enough money to last a week, if she didn't eat much. Despite these daunting circumstances, Julia, a striking 51-year-old woman with an aquiline profile and dark blonde hair, exuded an air of confidence. She sported a spotted cowhide vest, a silk neckerchief, and a black felt bolero. And since she was now in Manhattan, she had exchanged her cowboy boots for a pair of black pumps that added a few inches to her 5'4" frame. I had never been in a big city alone, Julie wrote many years later. And when I arrived in New York, I was so frightened I didn't know what to do. Those who knew her said she was fearless, but on this wintry day in 1931, she was desperate. Julia Bennett was in Manhattan to find guests for her new dude ranch, the Diamond J, the first in Montana to be exclusively owned and operated by a woman. Her timing could not have been worse. The stock market had crashed 16 months earlier, and the economy was continuing its rapid downward spiral into what soon would become known as the Great Depression. Unemployment stood at nearly 16%, and food riots were beginning to break out in some parts of the country. The historian Frederick Lewis Allen wrote that same year, "There was hardly a man or a woman in the country whose attitude toward life had not been affected in some degree by the sudden and brutal shattering of hope." In nearby Central Park, homeless men had set up an informal camp in its recently emptied reservoir. They derisively named it Hooverville, after the President of the United States. The richest Americans, however, still owned 40% of the nation's wealth, and it was this elite group that Julia Bennett, an accomplished big game hunter, was targeting. A veneer of prosperity still was evident at the intersection of Fifth Avenue and 46th Street, where she stood outside the Northern Pacific office. In these parts of the city, women still dressed in fur coats and had the means to shop at Saks Fifth Avenue and join their friends for lunch at Schraff's. Julia herself had no steady income. and hadn't laid eyes on her ne'er-do-well husband Anson in more than a decade. Although their son was now grown, she was raising their 16-year-old daughter alone. Julia urgently needed money to pay off the $13,000 she had been loaned by a group of Montana businessmen to finance the construction and outfitting of her new ranch, which she had designed and built with the help of a few out-of-work wranglers. She was planning to open it to guests for the summer season in just 4 months. $13,000 was no small change. It was the same amount it had cost Charles Lindbergh to finance his solo flight across the Atlantic 4 years earlier, and about $200,000 in today's dollars. I was broke and way in debt, so I realized I must get the ranch booked. But how? Julia wrote. Times were hard throughout the country, but they were especially hard in Montana, the only state that had lost population in the previous year's U.S. Census. Although penniless, what Julia Bennett did have in spades was energy, charm, and resourcefulness. And she hoped that some of the wealthy East Coasters she planned to meet still had enough money to spend their summer out on the range, living their idealized version of the cowboy life. Back in Montana, Julia wore jeans and a plaid flannel shirt while hunting and working on her ranch. But here in New York, she dressed as if she were starring in a motion picture western. She knew what she was selling. Julia Bennett knew her subject well. Among the settlers arriving in Virginia City in 1864 had been her young, recently widowed grandmother, Elizabeth Nave Martin, and her 8-year-old daughter, Lulie. They were fleeing their home in northern Missouri, where a civil war within the Civil War had turned neighbor against neighbor and left them with no apparent option other than escape. That's the end of the first chapter.
That's awesome. Well, I just have to say that I love the way that you set up the book, because we start in the scene, similarly, you start in the middle of things, as I say, but by the middle of the book, you're like, you know all the backstory of how she got there, and you're like, oh my gosh. So you build our connection with her, and I thought that was so beautiful the way you structured your book. How did you decide, and how did you figure that out, that was the best way? Because I mean, I can see that scene like it's in a movie.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I'm glad you liked it, and it's an interesting question because it took me 10 years to write this book and write and research it. And I played with it a lot. And actually, so my background is as a journalist and communications, public relations person. And so all my life, my writing has been nonfiction. And I decided to enroll in the MFA program at Butler University because I wanted to learn how to structure a nonfiction story in a fictional way. One of my favorite authors is Eric Larson, who wrote Devil in the White City and Splendid in the Vial and many other books. And what I love about his work is that he takes history and he takes true stories and makes you want to keep reading. I mean, he writes them as if they were fiction. And that's what I wanted to achieve with my book. It's all true, but I wanted you to feel like you were in the story. And actually, the idea to start it in New York City came with the help of some of my wonderful professors at Butler who really taught me about fiction and starting in the middle, setting it in the scene. And I thought, Julia in New York, well, let me show you a picture, because here is a picture of Julia in New York.
Oh my gosh, I love it.
She is this is the second year that she went back to New York to get guests. And this is the Waldorf Astoria in the background. And she is on the roof of the Roosevelt Hotel where she was staying with this gentleman whose name was Chief Max Bigman. And he was Native American chief on a tour of the United States. They met each other in the Roosevelt Hotel, and a photographer in the dining room asked them to go up on the roof of the hotel and take their picture. And I don't know who had the buffalo robe. I'm guessing it might have been Julia because she always brought a lot of props to put in shop windows to attract guests. And in one of these images, there's a couple of different ones. The chief is making the sign, Buffalo All Gone, which also figures into the story because Julia's father was a buffalo hunter back in the 1850s and
Yeah.
60s. So that picture, I think, is evocative of Julia and of what she did to try to get business at her dude ranch.
I feel like she was a great marketer, like I feel like she and Charmian would have gotten along in that aspect. They were really good at selling their stories and positioning themselves to tell them.
Yes, yes. I
That's
think they were both modern women ahead of their times.
yeah. Well, you said you spent a lot of time on researching this book. I mean, I can only imagine the work that went into that. I mean, the first thing is what drew you to their story. And how did you find the story of Julia Bennett and then the story of her mother and grandmother.
I found this story. My brother used to live in Montana, and he was friends with a woman named Sherry Pepper, who has become a dear friend. And she had told my brother offhandedly, I want somebody to write about my grandmother. And my brother asked, well, what did she do? And Sherry said, well, she was the first woman to own and operate a dude ranch in Montana. My brother happened to mention that to me. He didn't even know that at the time I was looking for a project. And I thought, well, that sounds really fascinating. I had not been to Montana before my brother moved there, and I just fell in love with it. And so when I met Sherry, and then I discovered that she had all of her grandmother's photo albums and her father's scrapbooks, and there was so much material. I thought, well, and the ranch still exists, the Diamond J outside of Ennis. It still looks much the same as it did when Julia built it in 1931. You can still go stay there. And so I thought it was going to be Julia's story. And then I found in the Montana Historical Society Julia's grandmother's 1867 diary when she went to San Francisco to try to earn money as a seamstress to pay off her dead husband's debts. And that's when I realized, oh, this is really a story about three women, not just one. So that's why it took so long.
Well, your descriptions of Montana made me want to go there. I mean, you could tell that you had actually done your research on the ground and experienced the natural beauty in person, because I could feel it when I was reading it. So how do you feel that your scholarship, I think we're both doing this recovery scholarship. How do you feel like your scholarship contributes to the reimagining of the American West?
Well, it's interesting because when I was growing up, I never liked watching Westerns because I just wasn't interested in gunfights and it held no appeal to me. But I've always been interested in the stories of women who did interesting things. I think Amelia Earhart was the first person that I really became fascinated with as a child. And so as I was researching this book, I realized it's starting to change rapidly, but there had been so little literature about women in the West. And when you learn about people like Julia, who really built this on her own, and then her widowed mother, who in her 20s went out and had to build a life, and she married a cattle rancher, and she raised children, and she had to do everything on the ranch. It was just really interesting to me to see how it, to learn about some of the women that we know about. For example, Jeanette Rankin, who was the first woman in the U.S. Elected to Congress, who was also from Montana. And one woman who I know who was raised on a ranch in Montana said something to me that I thought was interesting and telling. She said, we didn't do we didn't care about doing what was ladylike. When you grow up on a ranch, you just do what has to be done.
Yeah.
And and that was I thought, yeah, that explains a lot.
I think that's part of like the idea of these gender norms that we and stereotypes that are kind of around this era of women is the reality was that most women that have had active, intellectually engaged lives could not, did not live. They did whatever they could to not have to wear like giant skirts and, like Charmian sewed her own pants because she didn't want to ride a horse side saddle. She thought it was ridiculous. So I think that's part of the allure of learning and opening up these stories is that when young girls are reading about, the American West in the future, hopefully they won't just see young, like Little House on the Prairie as the only alternative of what you can do with your Western life.
Absolutely, absolutely. And
No offense to Laura Ingalls Wilder.
no, no, but yeah, there are so many stories. One person I discovered in my book, that I mentioned in my book, she was a newspaper reporter who rode all through Montana, writing stories about the people she met, all by her,
Wow.
all alone at the turn of the century. And then Julia herself got a job as a Fuller brush salesperson. Even though the ad said only men need apply, she applied. She got the job. She wasn't very good at it, but she, I think, like Charmian, she did what she had to do, and she was a big game hunter. Her father taught her to be a big game hunter, and she
Didn't you say she bagged a 500-pound bear?
yeah, yeah. The lady was good with a shot, is what one newspaper article said.
I love how the newspaper article tried to like get the guy she was hunting with to like give him credit. And he was like, oh no, she did
Yes.
it.
Yeah. I see we have a question here from Jane. Hi, Jane. I happen to know Jane. Thanks for tuning in. There are many similarities between Julia and Charmian. Have Lisa and Iris discussed a joint writing project?
Not yet.
Not yet, but we were really glad we got to know each other through this Montana Book Festival.
Definitely. We definitely have similar interests, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But that's a good question.
So what are you? Oh, God, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was asking some questions.
Oh, no. I was just going to ask you if you're working on something else right now.
Yeah, actually, I just returned from Oklahoma where I was doing research on the writer Sonora Babb, and I'll be writing my next I am writing my next biography on her. She was a Dust Bowl writer, wrote an amazing novel called Whose Names Are Unknown, and she was from Oklahoma and ended up going to LA to become a writer and worked in the FSA camps, the one in Weed Patch, and was writing her own novel, had a contract with Random House, and was going to be flown out to New York to finish the book. And she shared her notes with John Steinbeck when he came to visit the camp, and willingly. And he ended up finishing his book before she did because she stayed at the camp volunteering. And then when she went back to finish her book in New York, one day Bennett Cerf called her into his office, and he had totally cleared the desk of everything except for a check, and was like, I'm really sorry, Sonora Babb, but we are unable to keep your contract because John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath is doing so well, and we can't have more than one book about the Dust Bowl.
Oh
And
my
so
gosh.
she tried and tried to get it published, even famously had it edited and by her friend Ralph Ellison, who was like, you have to do it because she had her book is like, so it includes like not just white men that are telling the story, right? It's women have power in the story, and there's African American characters, there's Filipino characters, there's Mexican characters, because that's who were actually in the fields. And so once that happened, she ended up not publishing the book until late in her life, right before she died. And so her story is really an interesting story because a lot of women writers from that era have similar stories like this. And so I've been immersed in her story for the last year and really enjoying it. And I think a lot of people will be uh, interested to know the true story about her work.
Oh, that sounds fascinating. Can't wait
Yeah.
to.
So what are you working on these days?
Well, right now, I'm taking a little hiatus
Yeah,
because of
your book just came out. My
my
book
book.
came out a year ago, so that's
But I do have another project that I spent last winter working on. Also about another strong woman who nobody knows about. A woman who grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, became a social worker and an attorney, and actually helped rescue Jewish refugees from Europe during World War II and resettle them in South America. And
wow.
she lived in Uruguay, Argentina, Paris, traveling by herself to all these places to help resettle people. And she died tragically in an airplane crash on her very last mission. Um, and her story is fascinating as well. And I might add in a few other World War II women. As you know, you never know where these stories might go once you start doing more research.
Yeah.
But it's a fascinating story.
That sounds fascinating. Yeah, I mean, there's so much work to be done in this space. I feel, I don't know about you, but finding this space to write in has been so empowering. You know, I always considered myself a feminist, but it wasn't until like the actual action of doing this and like they used this that right behind me is Charmian's house, the House of Happy Walls, and they used my book along with other scholarship to help remodel the exhibit so that it actually tells Charmian's story truthfully and adds in like her accomplishments, and even includes like the story of Joy, the baby that she and Jack had together that only survived 38 hours, but was so important to her that she noted it in her diary every single year, celebrating her death, or what would have been her birthday. So, things like that. Like I think, for example, like in your book, you talk about how when they were going back from San Francisco to Montana, you talk about how um, um, is it Lulu that's recording her period? Like
Oh, Lizzie, yeah,
Lizzie
Lizzie,
like
yeah,
writes down every time she is having her period, and you really bring it in. That's not something that, and no offense, but I don't think a man would think about that in writing a book and how uncomfortable that would have been during that time period. It's not like there were no there was no material to buy at the store to help you, right? Like, and you talk a little bit about that in the book. I think those details are like things that, like, talking about um birth control in a time when it wasn't available to women, things like that. I think these are important aspects that as female writers we might have more insight into and open up as a topic in these books. And it really opens up our our overall knowledge of the whole West and who lived there. And I think people can really relate to that.
yeah. I think that stagecoach ride that Lizzie, Julia's grandmother, and her daughter Lily take from San Francisco to the Montana Territory. It took a month. They had to. I can't even imagine. Her daughter was ill along the way. Um, had a fever. She had to find medicine. And it's interesting that you mentioned her period, because that was something that I found in her diary that I thought it was a mystery, because she kept writing periodically. She would write the words lady company. And I was thinking, what is lady company? I don't, did she meet a friend? I was trying to, and then I realized as I looked at the dates, oh, every month she talks about lady company. And her lady company started the day she had to get on the ship to go back she took a ship up to get up to Washington State and Oregon. And then her lady company came when she was in the stagecoach. And yeah, it really opens up a world of something that I think most women can relate to that you don't really hear too much about. It was
Yeah.
actually hard for me to, I actually was like, well, what did they do?
I know.
And I found a book about the history of that. Fortunately, there's a woman who's written a book about that. But
That's
you're right;
awesome.
those are things that aren't usually covered, which half of the population knows something about. So
Yeah, and that's something like I would have liked to have learned about, growing up and reading. I used to always like try to read, what if Little House on the Prairie had told us some of that information,
yeah.
Oh, that's funny.
So
Um,
go ahead.
oh no, I was just gonna talk about like for me processing, I think part of what was difficult was processing the material as a I'm a poet in addition to being a nonfiction writer. And for me, I was so emotionally involved in this story that I mean that first chapter I had to write like 100 times because I was so mad at Irving Stone for really messing up her story. But I also found that, especially when I was reading Charmian's primary material, like her actual log of the Dirigo, which is this gorgeous diary she wrote while they were going around Cape Horn on this ship, that I had to write poetry as a way to process it. And so I really ended this process with 2 books. And I was wondering what was your process like with, and as I'm starting my new project, I'm finding I have a new creative way, like I'm doing an erasure of the Grapes of Wrath right now as a way to, like feel empower myself into telling the story. And I'm wondering what was your process for telling the story and getting into it? Because it does like take some time to get into the process of
Mhm.
it and process the emotions of the story.
Yeah, well, I think my journalism background is what really helped me write this because I actually tended to not write it from start to finish. When I found an interesting story within the story, I would write that. So I would write a chapter about a particular topic and really research the heck out of it. And then I would do the same. And then I got to the point where it's like, how do I put all these things together? Um, one wonderful resource for me was Anne Lamont's book, Bird by Bird, which I love.
Great
And
book.
she talked about cutting up her manuscript into little pieces and actually rearranging it. And I did that too. So, because there's so much material, as I'm sure that you dealt with. There's so much, and how do you condense it into a story and not just make it a litany of and then this happened and then this happened.
Right.
Um,
Fact and fact and fact
yeah.
and fact.
So what worked for me was well, and I have to say that working with Sherry Pepper, Julia's granddaughter, who so kindly provided me with access to all of the family materials, and I would go visit her and she would tell me stories. And so I never met Julia, but Sherry herself is a firecracker of a woman who I adore. And I felt that, well, Julia must be a lot like Sherry. So emotionally, that helped me understand the story because I had that connection with Sherry, who lived this story and was able to help get me a sense, give me a true sense of what I think her grandmother was like.
We have some love for Bird by Bird in the chat. And I think
Oh,
someone else is curious about the book that you mentioned on um
oh
women's
boy, I'm
minstrel.
gonna have to look in my bibliography.
Yeah, see?
Um,
Well, another thing is someone could buy your book and look in your bibliography.
well,
That would
that's
be it.
true, Iris.
Not
uh,
in a mean way.
I have a really long bibliography. I don't know if I'm gonna be able to come up with it,
But now we know we can find the book
but,
in your
but
bibliography.
it is in the bibliography. Yes.
Well, it is such a great book. I feel lucky that I got to spend so much time with it. And I mean, what a title, too. I wanted to ask how you came up with that title because I
Oh,
love it.
Good question. So Burning the Breeze, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out a title, and one day I was looking at a list of Western slang words, and
As you do on a Saturday night.
as I did, yes. And Burning the Breeze is Western slang, kind of cowboy speak for riding at full speed. And when I read that, I thought that is what these women did. They
Mm,
burned the breeze. And that's how I came up with that title.
I love that. I love it. It's so much. So my original title for my book was Smiling into the Ruins. And my editors were like, no. I
I like it.
got to use it for a poem title, so it
Oh,
worked.
good, good. Well, I loved your book too. And Charmian was a fascinating woman, and I loved learning about her and all the amazing things she did. And I'm so glad that somebody brought her back to the forefront because she deserves that attention.
Yeah, I hope that my book gets other people, I'm sure I didn't get everything perfect, as you say, writing a biography about someone who's been erased, there's so much more work to be done. So I hope that my book inspires many more people to explore her life and the lives of people around her, like Eliza. Jack's stepsister was an amazing woman. I definitely have her on my list of people I want to write about. Just really just against all odds, just fierce. And another person, I don't know if you've ever heard of her, that I've thought about writing about is named Isabel Bird. Have you ever heard of her?
Yes,
You
yes.
have? Okay, of course you have. She is amazing, and she's Scottish, a travel writer that went all over the
Yeah.
world, like Korea, like you name it. She was there, and she was originally did it. Her first, like the reason why she did these excursions at first is because she wanted to be able to wear pants. She didn't want to have to wear a skirt anymore, and she knew that if she was traveling on a boat or she was traveling in a carriage or like outside of the proper society, she could actually wear pants and live freely. And I feel like there's this whole world of women that I want to get to know. And someone once said to me, don't you get, I hear that most people after they write about them, you get tired of them and you don't ever want to talk about them anymore. And I bet you feel the same way as me. I feel the opposite. I feel so lucky that like now Charmian's permanently in my imagination, and now Sonora is coming to the table, and like I got them there forever. It's so great. I mean, you have a great party in your head too.
I do. And I was actually sad when I was done with the book because I loved researching their lives and I loved writing about them. And they do live in my head. But one thing that we both know is that there are so many more stories out there
Yeah.
to write about women. So I think we'll be spending the rest of our days finding women to write about.
Which is so lucky. I mean,
Yeah,
I can't I'm so happy to have found this, and I can't wait to write more books.
me
I
too.
can't wait to hear your books, your future books.
Well, stay tuned.
I loved this conversation, you two. Any conversation that involves periods, like I am on board.
I know. We should all
I am
talk
on
about periods
board.
more.
Yeah, yeah. For audience members who are interested in history, but interested in the creative writing part that has kind of been, being threaded throughout this conversation. And perhaps this is just because I was present during this conversation earlier today, but a novel that's really, really interesting to read, a historical novel that includes Montana, is Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead. And I kind of get the same kind of book giddiness thinking about her book that I get when thinking about your books too. So anyway, that's my own throwing out there. And I just want to thank both of you so much for being here. Thank you for your books. Thank you for your research. Thank you for your time. Thank you, audience, for being here and asking questions. And thank you to our event sponsors, Arts Missoula, MissoulaEvents.net, the Whitefish Review, Humanities Montana, and the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation. We've been throwing these links out throughout the conversation, but I do want to remind you that you can purchase Iris's and Lisa's books at Fact and Fiction Books, and be sure to enter MBF at checkout so that a portion of those proceeds come back to the festival so we can continue programming like this. So thank you again, everyone. Thank you, Iris, Lisa. Congratulations on your book. Congratulations on your books.
Thanks
Thank
for
you so
having
much.
us. It was
Of
fun.
course, of course.
Yeah, it's great.
Let me know when you make it to Montana.
Okay.